Two girls, soaked and shivering, beg a clinic for help, only to find every adult's gaze turned away from their suffering. They said winter would be hard, but no one warned how silent the world could become when hope runs thin. On a lonely Maine night, a cop haunted by grief and his scarred dog cross paths with two abandoned girls, each clinging to the last threads of strength. What follows isn't just a rescue, but a test of whether ordinary people and a battered dog can become the miracle that saves a life. Stay. Watch. Some stories thaw even the coldest hearts. Bar Harbor, Maine, a town edged by gray sea and granite. Thanksgiving is near. The cold has come early this year. It's the hour between afternoon and evening when the day lingers, uncertain, as if even the sun is reluctant to leave. The wind off the Atlantic is sharp with salt, biting against the wooden siding of the small police station on the edge of town. Its yellow porch light flickers, brave but faint, against the growing dusk. The old clock inside the lobby ticks with a muffled certainty that feels out of place in this uncertain light. Frank Moreland stands in the open doorway, hands jammed deep in the pockets of his faded wool coat, collar turned high against the cold. He's tall, broad-shouldered, a little stooped these days, as if the weight of old winters and old news presses down between his shoulder blades. His hair, peppered with gray, is cropped short but not tidy. There are lines at the corners of his eyes that have nothing to do with laughter. A man shaped by storms, by duty, by the quiet aches that accumulate in the pockets of years. The air tonight is heavy with the promise of more snow. You can smell it. Clean, metallic, mingling with the scent of distant seaweed and the darker tang of engine oil from boats docked at the harbor. Somewhere, the bells of the Unitarian Church ring out the hour, the notes rising and scattering into mist, unanswered. At Frank's feet, on the second step, lies Sage. The German shepherd is a quiet shadow on the threshold, a patch of silver and smoke against the dull boards. His head rests on his forepaws. His chest rises, falls. His eyes are half closed, the kind of watchful doze that isn't really sleep. There's a scar just above his right haunch, a furrow of old white on the dark pelt, and the fur along his chest is thick enough that the wind seems to go around him rather than through. Frank looks down, his gaze tracing the slow, patient rhythm of Sage's breathing. For a moment, he lets himself rest in that steadiness. The world, for all its commotion, is far away. Just the dog, the steps, the gold wash of the porch light, and the cold that makes his knuckles ache. There is a battered bench by the door, blue paint peeling. On it, a child's red wool scarf, probably dropped by someone in the morning rush to the school bus. Frank picks it up without thinking, brushes away a crust of frost, and lays it gently on the bench. It is the kind of small, silent kindness he performs daily, as if these gestures could stitch the world together again, thread by thread. He rubs his hands together, the friction dull against skin grown rough from years of putting out fires, both literal and otherwise. There's a memory tonight, uninvited but insistent, of another winter not so long ago. A night when the sirens never came fast enough, when hospital doors opened too late, when someone he loved slipped away while he stood helpless, frozen by paperwork and protocol. The hurt never fully left him. It has only learned to go quiet beneath the business of living. Still, as the sky bruises with early night, he feels it stirring, the ache in his chest, familiar, unspoken. He straightens, breathes slow, determined not to let the chill get in. But there's more than weather pressing against him. There's Thanksgiving next week, another holiday where the house will be empty, just him and Sage. The scent of roast turkey won't linger in the rooms. The table won't groan under too much food and too much noise. He tells himself it's fine. He tells himself he prefers the quiet, the order, the old soldier's habit of refusing to need, to ask, to admit that he's tired. Tired of being the last post, the one people lean on. Behind him, the radio on the dispatcher's desk clicks softly. An update from the next town over about a stray cow on the highway. Nothing urgent. The world keeps moving. Frank leans against the railing, his breath visible in the air. He tells himself he's here for the town, for the people who might need help, that he can carry whatever comes, as always, pretending strength is easier than letting anyone see where he's splintered. Below, Sage stirs. The dog lifts his head, ears pricking into the wind. For a second, Frank almost envies the dog's clarity, his unashamed presence, the way he feels and acts without apology. Sage does not pretend not to be cold, or tired, or lonely. He simply endures it, silent, steadfast. There's a lesson there, but Frank is too old, too stubborn to learn it tonight. A car rolls slowly past on the street. A battered Subaru, its headlights blurred by the mist. The driver's face is a ghost behind the glass, then gone. Somewhere a gull cries, hungry and far from the ocean. The street is empty again. Frank glances at Sage, the dog's amber eyes meeting his for a heartbeat, before turning back to the dark. There's comfort in that exchange. Not words, not promises, just a shared knowledge. This is what it means to stay, even when staying hurts. The wind gusts, sharp enough to sting his eyes. He blinks, presses his palms to his face, trying to steel himself against what always is, this time of year. The town is quiet, too quiet. It feels as if everyone is waiting for something, a thaw, a miracle, or just the courage to admit how tired they are. He sighs, low and rough, the sound lost in the wind. Inside, the overhead lights flicker on their timers. Time to go in, check reports, call it a night, keep moving. The sky, however, is already shifting, the blue fading toward black, the promise of snow drawing closer. Frank stands, tall but suddenly fragile, a man held together by routine and duty. Sage gets up, shakes off the cold, and falls into step behind him. For a moment, just before he turns, Frank hesitates on the porch. There is a tension in his jaw, a glisten in his eyes that has nothing to do with the wind. The dog, feeling the shift, sits quietly at his side. No words, no orders, just a presence. For a long minute, Frank lets himself feel the weight. He does not wipe his eyes. He does not straighten his spine. For the first time in a long while, he lets himself be what he is. Tired, grieving, grateful. The porch light glows, thin and golden, against the cold. Sage leans into him, silent, breathing in the same rhythm. And for this small moment, neither man nor dog pretends. They just are, here together, in the early dark of winter, holding each other up against the wind. The rain had turned fine and needling by the time the last ferry horn called out from the bay. Along Main Street, the few yellow bulbs left burning behind cafe windows looked faint against the blue-gray dusk. Bar Harbor was a town that kept its secrets in winter. Most windows were shuttered, curtains drawn early to the night. On the far side of the street from the police station, just beneath the dripping eaves of an old pharmacy, two small shapes pressed close together, fragile against the concrete and the wind. They looked like shadows at first, almost part of the city's debris. Two little girls, twins by their matching angles, and the identical threadbare coats clinging to their shoulders. The older one, if either could truly be called older, walked with a careful, uneven step, bearing the limp, drowsy weight of her sister. The younger girl's cheek rested against her shoulder, hair damp and matted, lips slightly parted, as she breathed in ragged, shivery gasps. There was no drama in their arrival, no shouts or cries for help. The only sound was the soft drag of worn soles on the wet sidewalk, the muted jingle of a zipper, the faintest cough lost beneath the sigh of the rain. In the crook of her arm, the elder sister clutched a faded backpack, its bottom threadbare, a faded cartoon badge peeling at the corner. She stopped in front of the pharmacy, now closed, but the light still on in the back where a tired woman counted cash for the register, and scanned the street, uncertain. Her free hand found her sister's fingers, squeezing gently, knuckles showing white in the cold. The child's eyes darted toward the glowing cross of the next building, a small walk-in clinic, its windows bright, the word open flickering in neon pink. For a moment she hesitated, staring at the grown-ups inside, at the warmth, the safe, ordinary boredom. She squared her shoulders, wiped a strand of wet hair from her cheek, and crossed to the clinic door. Her legs shook, but her chin lifted in that strange way children sometimes have, imitating the bravest adults they have ever seen. She pressed the bell. Inside, the woman at the reception desk, a narrow-faced lady in a maroon cardigan, cheeks pink with fatigue, looked up. There was a moment of confusion. The girl tried to speak, but her voice came out thin and flat, her teeth chattering with cold and something deeper, more desperate. She tried again, forcing her lips to form the words, "Please, my sister." Behind the desk, the receptionist fumbled for her glasses, startled by the sight of two children so late, so small, so out of place in a world of flu shots and insurance forms. The doctor on duty, a gaunt man with a tidy beard, paused at the edge of the hallway. He watched, hands in the pockets of his white coat, brows pinched together. "Do you have your insurance card?" the woman asked, voice polite, rehearsed, the rhythm of routine dulling her concern. The girl shook her head, almost imperceptibly. "Any papers at all? Parent or guardian with you?" Again the girl's lips barely moved. The doctor's eyes met the receptionist's, an entire conversation passing between them. A calculus of risk, paperwork, protocol, and the strange, unspoken fear of crossing some invisible line. He shook his head, so faintly only someone watching for disappointment would have noticed. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. We need an adult to sign you in." The words, though gentle, landed like pebbles on a frozen lake, each syllable breaking the thin crust of hope beneath the girl's feet. The little sister whimpered, her head rolling against her sister's collar. The older girl only tightened her grip, pressing her lips together. She looked back, searching the waiting room for a kind face, a witness, but the handful of patients waiting, an old man with a cough, a mother and her restless child, kept their eyes lowered, focused on magazines, shoes, anything but the two trembling figures by the door. No one came forward. No one spoke. In the hush that followed, the bell above the door tinkled as the wind shoved it shut behind them. The girls stepped back onto the slick sidewalk. The clinic's warmth evaporated instantly, leaving only the night, the wet, and the faint pulse of neon reflected in the puddles. The older sister guided her sibling to a low stoop beneath the clinic window. She sat down, pulling the smaller girl into her lap, arms circling, rocking with a quiet insistence as if by holding tight enough, she might will her sister's fever away. Raindrops tapped a restless pattern on the battered awning above, echoing the shudder of her breath. They sat in the shadow of the door for a long minute, alone but not noisy in their suffering. The street lamp cast a soft, buttery oval of light onto the sidewalk, painting their small shapes in gold and ash. The traffic was thin at this hour. A single car passed, tires hissing in the gutter, the driver not glancing left or right. In the distance, church bells faded into the silence. For a moment, the world itself seemed to pause, a hush so deep it made the heart ache. Across the street, in the glow from the police station, Sage lifted his head. The dog's ears caught a sound beyond the range of grown-up attention. A tiny cough, a broken sigh, the kind of sound animals never ignore. His eyes found the shapes huddled across the road. Two children huddled against the cold, their outlines blurred by rain and fatigue. Frank, watching the wind stir trash along the curb, noticed the shift in Sage's posture. He followed the line of the dog's gaze, and something old and familiar pinched at his own chest. A memory of helplessness, of all the times he'd told himself not my problem, only to lie awake at night, haunted by what he'd left undone. For a second, he stood frozen in the doorway, the embodiment of every adult who's ever watched a child's pain from a safe distance. Then, slowly, without a word, he stepped off the porch and into the drizzle, crossing the street with Sage at his side. There was no heroism in it, just a kind of silent surrender, the admission that sometimes what hurts the most is not the weather or the world, but the refusal to look suffering in the eye. Behind them, the town exhaled, a long breath into darkness. The world did not change, but the pattern of footsteps, the line of a dog's back, the stubborn courage of a child's embrace. These things, in their quiet, became the beginning of something that might someday be called hope. The rain eased into a cold, persistent mist that blunted the edges of everything, softening the world to silence. Under the deep awning outside the shuttered clinic, the two sisters huddled together, their shapes barely distinguishable in the gloom. The older girl, her name was June, settled onto the concrete stoop, bracing herself so her sister wouldn't slip from her lap. The younger, Violet, was feverish, her breathing fast and shallow, cheeks glazed with the sheen of sickness. A lock of damp hair stuck to her brow. Each exhale came out in little clouds, dissolving into the night. June's arms circled Violet in a practiced gesture, gentle but firm as rope. She'd done this before, through nightmares, through thunder, through the hours waiting for their mother to come home from whatever job paid enough to keep the lights on. But this night was different. She could feel it in the way Violet's head grew heavier, in the way her own spine ached under the weight, in the soft, trembling moan that sometimes escaped her sister's lips. The cold seeped up from the stone, through June's thin jeans, through the holes in her shoes, until she could not tell whether the shiver in her arms was hers or Violet's. Still, she held herself together. It was what she'd always done, be the strong one. When their mother died, when the landlord turned the key in the last lock, when every kindness in the world seemed to dry up, June had pretended she was made of something solid. She'd kept her tears private, curled beneath a blanket, muffling sobs in the crook of her arm, never in front of Violet, never where anyone could see. The secret strength of children who have no other choice. But now, as the world spun on outside their fragile bubble, June felt the thinness of her own shell. She looked down at Violet, tracing the shape of her lashes against fevered skin, and felt the urge to cry rise up in her like a tide. She squeezed her eyes shut, biting her lip until she tasted the metallic tang of blood. Not now. Not yet. A hush settled. Cars passed, but only in the far distance. Even the rain had lost its sharpness, the drops muffled by the fraying fabric of June's coat. Somewhere, someone laughed behind a closed window, the sound warm and remote as a memory from another life. Across the street, in the yellow haze of the police station's porch light, Sage shifted. The dog's breath puffed white in the air, his body tensed with that peculiar alertness animals have, a listening that goes beyond sound. Frank, standing at the curb, watched the way Sage's head tilted, his eyes narrowing in concentration. He'd seen that look before, in burning buildings, in the wake of storms, whenever Sage sensed trouble no one else could smell. For a moment, Frank hesitated. He'd spent a lifetime holding the line, being the steady hand, the one who went into danger so others wouldn't have to. But inside, he knew the limits of his own strength, the way regret carved out quiet places in the heart. He wondered, not for the first time, if pretending to be strong was a kind of lying. If Sage, in his canine honesty, could teach him how to bear witness to suffering without flinching. Sage made the decision for him, with a low, throaty whine, barely more than a breath. The German shepherd stepped off the curb. He moved with purpose, each paw silent against the wet pavement, tail down but steady, not threatening, not afraid. Frank followed, his own footsteps loud in the hush. It was the kind of moment that drew no notice, the world turning away as man and dog crossed the street toward something small and urgent. June didn't see them approach at first. Her head was bowed, cheek pressed to Violet's damp hair, lost in the hard work of not letting go. But Sage's presence when it arrived was undeniable, a warmth in the cold, a silent invitation to breathe. The dog stopped a few feet away, sitting down gently so as not to startle them. He waited. June felt his eyes on her, steady and brown and old. She blinked up, startled, then looked past him to Frank. Frank didn't speak. He crouched beside them, knees creaking. He let his hands rest loosely on his thighs, palms up. His face was weathered, unreadable, but his eyes held a tired kind of kindness. A recognition, maybe, of what it was to be the one who held things together until you couldn't anymore. Sage inched forward, lowering his nose to the back of June's hand. The touch was featherlight, warm, a wordless, "I see you." June flinched at first, the automatic recoil of someone unused to gentleness. But Sage didn't withdraw. He stayed still, head slightly bowed, ears soft. After a moment, June's fingers relaxed, resting in the thick fur at his neck. The dog's body radiated heat. His tail thumped once, slow and reassuring. Frank watched the exchange, silent. He recognized the tension in June's jaw, the exhaustion in her shoulders. It was the look of someone holding back a flood. He had seen it in his own mirror, in the quiet hours before dawn. He wanted to reach out, to say something that would make it easier. But he'd learned, over years of loss and service, that sometimes the only thing you can give is space, the grace of not demanding, not fixing, just being there. He nodded, once almost to himself. Then, without fanfare, he took off his jacket and draped it over June's shoulders. The fabric smelled faintly of wood smoke and soap. It was too big for her, but heavy, anchoring. June tensed, then relaxed into its weight. For the first time that night, she felt something inside her soften a little. Sage circled, lying down at their feet, his great head resting beside Violet's knee. His eyes never left June. He didn't urge or nudge, didn't force comfort, just lent his presence. In his stillness was an invitation. It's safe to let go. June let herself shudder just once. Not a sob. She wouldn't give in. Not here, not yet. But a tremor, a tiny fissure in the mask of bravery. Her throat hurt, Her eyes burned. Sage watched her, unwavering. If tears came, she knew he would understand. Above, the street lamp flickered, rain weaving silver threads through the night. The world held its breath. And in the circle of quiet carved out by dog and man, a child who had carried too much for too long began, for the first time, to feel that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be strong alone. Time does strange things in the cold. Sometimes it stretches, endless, in the ache of waiting. Sometimes it shrinks, whole lives changing in the span of a single breath. On that rain-washed sidewalk, for 6 quiet minutes, the world condensed to a single, fragile moment. A moment that held more than rescue, more than charity. It held the silent, wordless offer. I am here. You can let go. Frank didn't rush. The years had taught him that children, animals, even pain itself, can sense the difference between real patience and practiced urgency. He moved with a gentle certainty, as if the night had always been leading him to this. The clinic's neon sign cast a wavering pink glow across the pavement, reflecting in Sage's eyes as the dog remained pressed close to June and Violet. Frank reached out, but didn't touch. Instead, he lowered his voice until it was just above the hush of rain. "Come on," he said softly, but only after June had finally let herself meet his gaze, her mask of strength flickering, thin as fog. She didn't answer. She nodded, a slow, uncertain gesture, as if she'd been waiting for someone to see through her courage all along. Frank scooped Violet into his arms. The child was lighter than he expected, all bones and fever, head lolling against his shoulder. June rose on numb legs, still wrapped in the coat too big for her, clutching the tattered backpack. Sage stood, giving June the tiniest nudge with his shoulder, guiding her as though they had rehearsed this walk 1,000 times. They crossed the street together, man, dog, and 2 girls, moving not as a parade, but as a quiet procession, each step softened by the weight of what they'd carried alone. The hospital was only 2 blocks away, its windows glowing with the kind of unhurried light reserved for places where hope and waiting are always side by side. Inside, the air was bright, tinged with antiseptic and the soft shuffle of shoes against linoleum. It was late, and the waiting room was mostly empty, a few chairs occupied by the sleepless and the worried. No one stared. Maybe they recognized the look in June's face. Maybe they were too tired for curiosity. Frank walked to the triage desk. He set Violet gently onto the bench and motioned to the nurse, a woman with white hair in a long braid, her name badge tilted and unreadable. She didn't ask for insurance. She didn't ask why they'd come so late, or why Frank's badge was tucked into his pocket rather than pinned to his chest. She just looked at Violet, at the tight way June's hand wrapped around the backpack, at Sage who sat down without a command, and she opened the door to the exam bays. "Let's get her inside, honey." The nurse's words were quiet, threaded with a kindness that did not rush. June followed, Sage at her side. Frank trailed behind, rubbing a hand across his jaw. There were stories in every wrinkle of his face. In the small exam room, the light was softer, muted by the curtain drawn against the harsh glow of the hallway. Violet was laid on the bed, a thin hospital blanket pulled up to her chin. She whimpered, caught between sleep and fever, but the nurse's hands were practiced, gentle, a pulse oximeter clipped to her finger, a thermometer brushed against her brow, oxygen set flowing with a whisper. No questions about paperwork, no forms, just care. June stood by the bed, her face blank, knuckles white as she clung to the rail. Sage circled, then sat with a long sigh, his tail curled protectively around his paws. He watched Violet, then June, then Frank. His presence was as steady as the heartbeat on the monitor, a metronome of patience, a silent vow that no one here would be left alone again. Frank shrugged off the wet coat from June's shoulders, draping it over the back of a chair. He found a blanket in the supply cupboard, placed it over her without comment. He didn't speak. He let the hush linger, knowing that sometimes comfort is nothing more than the sound of another's breath nearby. He sat at the far edge of the room, not as a protector, but as a witness, his gaze never leaving the girls. Outside, the rain thickened against the window, beads running in slow, twisting paths. Sage's ears flicked at the sound, but he didn't move. The room held a delicate stillness, neither tense nor truly peaceful, more like the moment when a storm has just begun to break, the worst of the fear behind, the healing not yet begun. The nurse returned, her voice soft as felt. "She's stable, but we'll keep her tonight. Fever's high, but with care she'll come down." June looked at her, a question trembling in her eyes, but the nurse only pressed her hand. "Stay as long as you need." Frank nodded. The words weren't much, but they felt like warmth. Sage settled beside June, his fur a heavy weight against her leg. He yawned, the pink of his tongue vivid in the low light, and then he rested his chin on his paws. June, still fighting the last embers of her own strength, sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't look at Frank, but her hand, almost without her knowing, drifted to the dog's head, stroking once, twice. The first time, Sage stayed very still. The second time, he leaned just slightly into her touch. No one rushed them. No one demanded explanations or paperwork or tears. The room filled with the rhythm of soft breathing, the gentle beeps of a monitor, the hush of a world outside that had, for now, left them alone. In that long, healing silence, June felt the last scaffolding of her pretend strength shudder. For a moment, she pressed her lips together, but her shoulders began to shake. She was not loud. She did not sob, but her eyes flooded, and the tears ran warm and silent down her cheeks, soaking into the fur on Sage's neck. Frank watched, and for once he did not look away. He let her cry, bearing witness to a grief he knew too well. Sage pressed in, patient and present. The nurse turned away, giving space. For 6 minutes, and maybe for the first time since the world had upended, June let herself break. It did not make her weak. It made her real, and the room, which had been so brittle with silence, grew strong with the soft, almost holy sound of letting go. Night pressed in around the hospital, the windows banded with streaks of rain, the world outside distant and blurred. The air inside was warm, dense with the sense of disinfectant and coffee that had sat too long on a burner. Beyond the doors of the children's wing, the lobby glowed anemic beneath its fluorescent lights, the clock on the wall ticking out slow, deliberate minutes. Frank Moreland sat in the hard plastic chair near the doorway, one foot angled out, his elbow resting on his knee. He held a paper cup of coffee gone lukewarm, his hands wrapped around it more for comfort than heat. Every so often, he rolled the cup between his palms, listening to the faint shush of liquid, as if searching for something to do with his hands. The coffee itself tasted stale, but he drank it anyway. Sometimes the old rituals were what kept a man from coming apart at the seams. He was not a man used to waiting, but tonight, waiting was all he could do. There were no fires to put out, no chaos to manage, only the steady ache of watching over what he could not fix. It was a kind of helplessness he had never learned to bear well. a ghost that walked beside him on these long nights, whispering old regrets. Sometimes he wished he could pace, or step outside into the cool wind and the promise of the sea. But he did not move. He stayed. Beyond the thin wall, in a quiet room with the shades drawn and the overhead lights dimmed, June curled into the corner of the wide hospital recliner, her knees pulled up to her chest. The blanket Frank had given her was wrapped around her shoulders, pooling at her ankles. Violet slept fitfully in the hospital bed, her breathing eased by oxygen, her small fingers twitching at the edge of the sheet. In sleep, her brow smoothed, the lines of pain retreating. June did not sleep. She watched her sister's chest rise and fall, watched the soft, flickering lights of the monitor, the occasional silhouette of a nurse checking through the window in the door. Each time June held her breath, waiting for a new verdict. But each time the nurse only nodded, a tiny smile breaking through the fatigue. Sage sat beneath the window, eyes half closed, but his ears attuned to every sound, each cough, each whimper, each time June shifted. The dog's body was a bulwark between the world and the girls, solid as the earth, breathing slow and deep. When June's gaze drifted away from her sister and down to Sage, she felt a weight she had been carrying ease, if only for a moment. It was not comfort, not yet, but it was company, and sometimes that was more than enough. The rain outside traced uncertain lines down the glass. Beyond, the streetlights painted weak halos over empty parking lots, the night broken only by the passing beam of a distant patrol car. The sea, invisible, made itself known only through the faint, constant hiss in the dark, the sound of waves against stone, a lullaby for those with nowhere else to turn. Frank finished his coffee, crushed the cup in his fist, and tossed it in the bin. He rose and walked to the window at the end of the hall, peering out into the night. The reflection that looked back at him was not quite the man he remembered from younger years, his face softer, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper. He pressed a hand to the glass, feeling the chill, and for a moment closed his eyes, letting himself remember another night, another hospital, another child who hadn't woken up. There was a heaviness in his chest, a longing, not just for the daughter he'd lost, but for the man he'd tried to be for everyone else. The one who was always strong, always ready, never the one to sit and wait and hope. He felt the edge of tears and blinked hard, jaw tight. Not tonight, he thought. Not here. A shuffling behind him, a nurse, gentle-voiced, asking if he needed anything. He shook his head, barely smiling, and thanked her. She left him in peace. Back in the room, June shifted in the chair, letting the blanket slip from her shoulders. She reached into her backpack, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper and a stub of pencil. She began to sketch, slow, careful lines, drawing the shape of Sage curled beneath the window, the outline of Violet's sleeping face, the half-shadow of a man she barely knew standing outside the door. Her pencil strokes were steady at first, then softer, almost hesitant, as if afraid of what memory might bring up from the dark. As she drew, her shoulders loosened. She watched Sage, and the dog seemed to sense her attention, opening his eyes and lifting his head just slightly. June hesitated, then slid off the chair, crawling quietly across the tile to sit beside him. She leaned her back against his warm side, letting the heat bleed through her shirt. Sage did not move away. Instead, he stretched out, sighing through his nose, the deep rumble in his chest, almost a purr. The world outside the window was all shadows, but inside, a hush had settled. There was no need to pretend. June closed her eyes, her hand pressed against Sage's ribs, feeling the steady rhythm of his breath. She let herself relax, if only for the space of a few breaths, letting go of the need to be the strong one. She was just a girl, in the long night, with a sleeping sister and a dog who did not ask for anything more than her company. Frank, glancing in through the half-open door, saw the girl and the dog, two shadows in the soft light, and felt for the first time in a long while that maybe his presence was enough. Maybe on this night, being there was all that was required. He pulled the blanket from the back of the chair and draped it over June and Sage, tucking it in gently, not wanting to wake Violet or disturb the fragile peace that had settled. He stood there watching, his breath slow, his own grief softened by the sight of this small, new family forming in the quiet. The clock on the wall moved its hands. The wind rattled the windows, but inside, nothing shifted. In the hush of the hospital night, time expanded and contracted, holding space for those who needed it. June did not know when she drifted into sleep, only that when she woke, Sage's head was in her lap, and the first gray light of morning was bleeding into the room, gentle as a promise. Dawn came quietly to Bar Harbor, as it often does in late autumn, arriving not as a sudden blaze but as a gradual lessening of the dark. The hospital's courtyard outside June's window was swaddled in a thin, low fog, the last red maple leaves clinging to black branches, bright against the hush of silver grass and damp earth. Somewhere far off, a gull cried, lost and lonesome. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, pattering gently against the glass. Inside the room, the world seemed to hold its breath. The hush of the night had not broken, only softened, as if each soul inside the hospital were wrapped in one long, unbroken exhale. The fluorescent lights were off now, just the pale blue of dawn spilling in around the blinds, and the soft green pulse of monitors at Violet's bedside. Violet herself was curled beneath a hospital blanket, hair spread across the pillow, her lips parted in sleep. The tension had slipped from her face, the lines of pain easing, though her cheeks still bore the flush of fever. The oxygen mask sat askew. At some point, she had pushed it aside with a sleep-heavy gesture, stubborn even in rest. June lay sprawled beside Sage on the padded bench under the window, one arm flung across the dog's great body. The weight of her exhaustion had finally overtaken her sometime after midnight, but it was not a restless sleep. She dreamed in pale colors, the soft whoosh of the sea, the smell of rain on blacktop, her mother's voice somewhere out of reach. Sage, pressed close, had not stirred all night, as if holding vigil with the patience of stones and trees. Frank, too, had dozed and woken in turns, each time jolting upright at the shift of a shoe in the hallway, the soft chime of an elevator, or the distant wail of an ambulance arriving with some new crisis. The hard chair left a numbness in his legs and a heaviness in his chest, but he did not complain. There was a familiar rhythm to these hospital vigils, a memory that pressed at him from another life. He had been the one waiting in too many rooms like this, once as a father, later as a husband, too often as the friend who stayed when others could not. When the morning nurse came in, she did so quietly. Her shoes squeaked on the tile. She paused, a small smile in the half-light, as she looked at the sleeping girls, the curled shape of the dog. She adjusted Violet's blanket, checked the readings, and left a plastic pitcher of water on the table without a word. June stirred at the noise. She blinked, rubbing her eyes, confused for a moment by the strangeness of the room, the stiff sheets, the hum of machines, the gentle weight at her side. Then she saw Sage's head in her lap, the warmth of his fur anchoring her to the present. She let her hand drift through the thick ruff around his neck, her fingers tangling in the soft gray and silver. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply sit, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. A slip of paper, crumpled and smudged, was still clutched in her other hand. She looked down and saw the half-finished drawing, a line sketch of Violet sleeping, Sage curled close, the window streaked with rain. June stared at it for a long time, her pencil hovering in the air. She wanted to finish it, to mark down what could not be said, but her hand shook. She pressed the page against her chest instead. Frank appeared in the doorway, backlit by the hallway's gold light. He looked tired, unshaven, older than he had the night before, but his eyes were gentle. He carried 2 paper cups of coffee, the kind that steamed faintly in the chill of morning. He set one down beside June, saying nothing. She glanced up, gave him the smallest nod, and wrapped her hands around the cup, as if drawing heat from more than just the drink. Frank crossed to the window, looking out over the fog-damp garden. His own memories drifted in with the dawn. He saw, in the blurred glass, the echo of another hospital room. Years ago now, a younger man with a daughter in a blue nightgown, waiting for news that never came. The pain did not ache as sharply anymore, but it had never healed. Not really. There were scars inside him, old and deep, stitched together with habit and the slow work of survival. He turned, meeting June's eyes. She did not look away this time, though she did not speak. There was something between them, something like recognition, a silent acknowledgement that both of them, in different ways, had learned to live with what could not be changed. As the morning brightened, a new doctor arrived. She was young, but her manner was steady, her words soft, respectful of the silence in the room. She checked Violet's vitals, reassured June that her sister was through the worst, that she would recover, but would need rest and a safe place to heal. June only nodded, clutching the drawing tighter. The doctor glanced at Frank, pausing before she spoke. "Are you their guardian?" she asked quietly. Frank shook his head, his voice rough from disuse. "No, but I'll take care of the paperwork." The doctor looked at him, saw the truth in his face, and let it stand at that. She scribbled her notes, left as quietly as she'd come. June finally spoke, her voice hoarse and uncertain. "Will we have to leave?" The question hung in the air, not quite directed at Frank or the doctor, but at the world itself. Frank kneeled beside her, his knees cracking. He looked at her, not with pity, but with the gentle patience of someone who knows what it is to be left behind. "Not if I can help it," he said softly, the promise as steady as stone. Sage pressed closer, his body a barrier against the chill, against the fear. He nuzzled June's hand, and she managed a tired smile. There were scars everywhere, in bodies, in memories, in hearts too young to carry them. But in the hush of the hospital room, under the pale light of morning, there was also the beginning of something new. Not hope, not yet, but the slow return of trust, woven together in the small, unfinished sketches of a child, the steadfast warmth of a dog, and the silent promise of a man who refused, this time, to let anyone slip away. Late in the afternoon, a hush fell over Bar Harbor that belonged only to the edge of winter. The fog had rolled back to the sea, leaving the town washed clean and sharp under a low, clouded sky. The hospital's warmth faded into memory as Frank guided June, Violet, and Sage out beneath the eaves, the automatic doors sighing shut behind them. For a moment, the air tasted of salt and possibility. There was no parade, no crowd, Only the sound of feet against gravel and the wind tugging at the loose edges of coats. Frank's truck was waiting in the visitor's lot, battered and blue, with salt stains on the fenders and a patch of rust along the wheel well. He opened the back door and helped June settle Violet onto the seat, careful of the blanket still cocooned around her. Sage leapt up, finding his place beside the girls as naturally as if he'd done it for years. The dog's body filled the space between them, warm and steady. Frank drove in silence, the heater struggling to keep up. The radio turned low to an oldies station that crackled between songs. The town slipped past the windows, a line of empty shops, a bakery with its sign turned to closed, the post office still strung with last month's bunting. June watched it all with the wary eyes of someone not yet sure she was awake. Violet leaned against her, eyelids fluttering, her small fingers clutching the blanket as though it were a lifeline. Frank glanced in the rearview mirror, saw the way Sage pressed closer each time the truck jolted over a pothole, and felt a quiet pride. Dogs understood what people could not say. They turned off the main road onto a narrow lane that twisted through old pines. Frank's house stood alone at the end, a squat wooden cottage, white paint weathered to gray, shingles patched here and there by a careful, if not artful hand. The porch sagged gently under its own history, and the windows were clouded by salt and rain. It was not a pretty house, but it was shelter. It was his. He parked beneath a wind-bent spruce, cut the engine, and waited a moment, as if giving the place time to ready itself for newcomers. June slid out first, stiff from the ride, her shoes crunching on the frosty gravel. She took Violet's hand and guided her up the steps. Sage trotted ahead, nose twitching as he circled the porch, inspecting the corners, tail held low but hopeful. Frank unlocked the door and stood aside, letting the girls step in first. The house smelled faintly of coffee grounds, wood smoke, and something older, linen maybe, or the memory of bread. The living room was small but clean, the floors bare wood, a faded rug worn thin by years of boots and paws. On one wall hung a photograph in a crooked frame, a much younger Frank, hair darker, eyes less guarded, standing with a smiling woman and a girl in pigtails. June paused at the threshold, noticing the photograph, then looking away quickly, not wanting to intrude. "I know it's not much," Frank said, his voice gruff with the effort of understatement. "But it's warm, and you're safe." He pointed out the small bedroom, 2 beds pushed together and a chest of drawers with one stubborn drawer that never closed all the way. "You can take that room. I'll sleep on the couch." There was no argument. He did not expect one. Violet shuffled in, glancing at Sage, who explored the corners, sniffing at the frayed edges of the rug, the baseboards, the old quilt tossed over the arm of the couch. She dropped her backpack by the bed and sat, still bundled in her coat. June, unsure what to do with herself, began to tidy, straightening the pillows, folding the quilt, arranging their few belongings on the dresser. She moved quietly, as if afraid of disturbing the house's long silence. Frank returned from the kitchen with a sweater in his hands, thick and soft, the color of oatmeal. "My mother made this," he said, holding it out to June. "It should keep you warm." She hesitated, then took it, the wool scratchy against her skin, but heavy in a comforting way. She pulled it on, sleeves dangling past her hands, and for a moment, she looked much younger. Sage found his place beside the wood stove, lying down with a sigh. The fire was not yet lit, but the promise was there. June crouched beside him, scratching behind his ears, feeling his warmth seep into her bones. Violet crawled onto the couch, curling around a pillow, her eyes drifting shut almost at once. The tension in her small body unwound, her breaths slowing, deepening. Frank covered her with an extra blanket, tucking it under her chin. He moved through the house with the quiet assurance of a man who has learned how to share space without crowding, how to offer comfort without demanding gratitude. He set a kettle on the stove, sliced a loaf of bread, found jam in the back of the cupboard. When the tea was ready, he poured 2 mugs and brought them to the girls, setting them on the table without a word. Outside, Sage scratched gently at the back door, and Frank let him out to circle the yard. The dog barked once, sharp and bright, and June smiled, the first unguarded smile she'd worn in days. She found paper and colored pencils in her bag and sat at the table, sketching Sage as he ran along the fence, his shadow long in the afternoon light. The house filled slowly with small sounds, the kettle whistling, the soft thud of Sage's paws, Violet's even breathing, June's pencil moving on the page. Frank settled into his armchair by the window, gazing out at the gray sea, his heart softer than it had been in years. No one spoke much. There was no need. The warmth in the room was built not from words, but from presence, from patience, from the simple acts of making space for one another. In this house, old wounds began to knit, not through miracles, but through the ordinary magic of shelter, food, and company. Sage lay at June's feet, tail thumping once each time she glanced his way. Outside, the sky deepened to blue, the first stars trembling in the cold. Frank turned on a lamp, the light golden and soft, and for the first time since the hospital, he felt that maybe, just maybe, home was possible again, even for those who had almost forgotten the way. Winter set in without fanfare. The wind brought salt and ice from the sea, and the sky, low and gray, seemed to press the world smaller, drawing everyone and everything closer to whatever warmth could be found. The first days in Frank's house drifted by slowly. There was no schedule, only the rhythm of the weather, the simple cadence of meals, and the long, wandering silences that came with learning to breathe in a new place. Frank rose early each morning, sometimes before the sun, making coffee while the windows still rattled with the last echoes of night. The girls learned the sound of his footsteps, the soft clang of the kettle, the quiet cough he gave to test the air. He never knocked on their door, but always left breakfast on the table, a plate of toast, fruit from a can, eggs if the store had been open. The small offerings never announced, but always there. June woke before Violet, sitting up in the little bed and watching the room come into focus. Sunlight, faint and pale, threading through the lace of frost on the window. Sage would be waiting, tail thumping gently, body curled near the foot of the bed. He slept in the hall at night, but in the morning he was always there, his nose cold against her hand, his gaze quiet and constant. Some days Frank took them down to the beach, bundled tight in old coats and scarves. The sand was frozen, the tide out, and the wind cut through even the thickest layers. Violet would tire easily, but she insisted on coming, her hand tight in Frank's. June walked beside Sage, letting the dog lead the way, his nose buried in seaweed, his body braced against the gusts that threatened to knock them off balance. The world was stripped of color, all slate and bone, but there was a kind of peace in the emptiness, a space big enough for grief and hope and all the words they didn't have yet. On colder afternoons, when the sky pressed low and the clouds threatened snow, they stayed inside. June helped Frank with chores, sweeping the kitchen, folding laundry, sorting the mismatched cutlery. Violet watched from the couch, a sketchbook in her lap, her fingers moving hesitantly across the page. Sage followed the girls from room to room, his paws soft on the old wooden floors, always close but never in the way. He had a knack for settling himself at just the right distance, sensing when June wanted him close, when Violet needed a pillow, or when Frank needed to sit in silence with nothing but the quiet reassurance of a dog at his feet. Some evenings, Frank lit the wood stove and the four of them gathered around its glow. Violet curled in a patchwork blanket, her feet tucked beneath her. June stretched out on the rug. Sage sprawled at her side, head heavy in her lap. Frank sat in his chair, boots off, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. They watched the flames flicker, listened to the gentle pop and sigh of burning wood, the wind sifting around the eaves. The silence was never uncomfortable. Each of them held their own thoughts, letting them rise and fall in the hush. Frank sometimes glanced at June, catching her tracing the outline of Sage's ear, or staring at the fire with a longing he recognized. A yearning for something to anchor her, to prove that this peace was real. He wanted to speak, to promise her that it would last. But he understood the futility of such words. Trust was not given. It was built, breath by breath, day by day. There were moments when the old wounds flared, a nightmare that woke Violet in the dark, a sudden burst of tears from June when her pencil snapped, the way Frank sometimes went quiet after a phone call or news from the station. In those moments, Sage was always there first, his body anchoring the storm, his head nudging under a trembling hand, his eyes saying what none of them could. I'm here. I'm not leaving. It was on a day of thick snow and no school, when the world was white and silent, that the shift came clear. June and Violet had spent the morning drawing, filling page after page with sketches of Sage, of Frank chopping wood, of the lighthouse that blinked across the bay. Frank came in from the cold, his cheeks flushed, arms full of logs. He stomped his boots, then paused, watching the girls, how they laughed, how Violet reached for June's hand, how Sage danced in circles at their feet, barking once in delight. The sound startled them, then drew their laughter out, bright and surprised. After lunch, June stood at the window, watching the snow swirl in lazy spirals. She felt Frank step up beside her, his presence solid but not imposing. He rested a hand on her shoulder, just for a moment, and she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back, just a little, into the quiet certainty he offered. Their eyes met in the glass. No words passed between them, but there was an understanding. She was no longer only the strong one. She could be cared for, too. That evening, as dusk crept in and the stove warmed the room, Violet lay on the floor beside Sage, her fingers threaded in his thick fur. June sat nearby, pencil in hand, drawing the shapes of family. Frank in his chair, Sage with the girls, the glow of firelight. Frank looked up, meeting June's gaze. She smiled, tired but true. And he nodded, the smallest gesture, but it said enough. In the slow, gray days of winter, they healed together. Not through great confessions, not through sudden joy, but in the dailiness of meals shared, chores finished, fires tended, and the steadfast company of a dog who believed in the power of simply staying close. Winter's end came quietly. The snow melted slow and stubborn, receding in patches across the old yards and wooded lots. The air still bit at the skin, but the cold was softer, and the gray gave way sometimes to a blue sky fragile as china. By late February, Bar Harbor exhaled, a sigh of relief and renewal that seemed to touch everything from the sea's restless waves to the thin lines at the corners of Frank's eyes. One morning, a letter arrived, slipped through the slot in the weathered front door. The envelope was thick, the handwriting careful and old-fashioned. Town office, Bar Harbor. Frank stood in the hallway, turning the envelope over in his hands, uncertain. June and Violet watched from the kitchen table, their cereal bowls pushed aside. Sage sprawled between them, chin on his paws. Frank opened the letter slowly, his thumb rough against the seal. It was an invitation. To honor those who have brought hope, safety, and kindness in a hard winter. It was signed by the mayor and a list of names he recognized, some from childhood, some from the years since. June read it over his shoulder, her eyes widening, then looking away, shy. The day of the gathering, the town green was still spongy with thaw. Folding chairs were set up in neat, uncertain rows. Neighbors stood in small clusters, hands in pockets, nodding in that reserved way New Englanders have for acknowledging each other without fuss. A table was set up near the gazebo, draped in a blue cloth. Someone had placed a vase of snowdrops in the middle, winter's first tentative promise of spring. Frank arrived with June and Violet bundled in their coats, Sage on his leash, though the dog hardly needed it. As they stepped onto the green, faces turned, some familiar, some not. There were smiles, cautious but warm, and a kind of hush as they made their way to the front row. The ceremony was brief, almost businesslike. The mayor spoke, her voice steady but touched by something soft. She spoke of the hard winter, of small mercies, of the ways neighbors keep each other alive in towns that get forgotten when the world gets busy. She mentioned, with a nod, the officer who didn't look away, and the children who reminded us all how brave hope can be. June's cheeks burned, and she squeezed Violet's hand. Then the mayor turned to Sage. She knelt, her knees crackling, and slipped a red scarf around the dog's neck, the wool bright against his gray fur. To Sage, she said, who watched, who waited, who kept us company when we needed it most. The crowd clapped, not loud, not raucous, but real. June laughed, the sound surprised and unguarded. Violet knelt beside Sage, hugging his neck, her smile shy but brilliant. For a moment the dog's tail thumped in the muddy grass. After the speeches, neighbors mingled. People Frank barely knew brought them coffee in paper cups, slices of pound cake wrapped in napkins. Some told stories, of seeing Frank out in the storm, of Sage shepherding the girls on their walks, of the way the lights in his house had glowed on nights when it seemed nothing else would. One old woman pressed a photograph into June's hand. "I took this from my porch. That's all of you after the first snowfall." June looked at the picture for a long time. A slant of late sun, Frank and the girls on the porch, Sage poised at the step, watching the street as if he could hold the world safe. When it was time to go, the mayor found Frank. "Thank you," she said, and there was no ceremony in it, just a simple truth, the kind that carries its own weight. Frank nodded. "Wasn't just me," he replied, glancing at Sage and the girls. The mayor smiled. "It never is." That evening, they walked home slowly, the sky lavender and gold, the lighthouse beams sweeping the bay in regular intervals. Frank paused at the gate, holding the girls close, his hand on Sage's head. The house, battered as ever, looked different now. Something about the way the porch light pooled on the step, the laughter drifting out, the scarf still bright around Sage's neck. After dinner, as dusk deepened and the sea turned dark, Frank stood on the porch, mug in hand. June and Violet played at the edge of the yard, tossing a ball for Sage, their laughter skipping across the grass. Frank watched the lighthouse flash in the distance, every slow turn a promise, every beam a reminder that someone was always watching, always hoping, always ready to welcome the lost ones home. In that moment, Frank let himself think of all those who had gone before. His daughter, his mother, the friends who had drifted away. He missed them. He always would. But he did not feel hollow. He felt the weight of belonging, the deep, slow certainty that comes from having stayed, from having said yes, from having let himself be needed. Behind him, Sage bounded up the steps, mud on his paws, red scarf bright in the porch light. June followed, face flushed, her hands full of wild snowdrops. Violet lagged behind, still a little tired, but smiling as she leaned into Frank's side. He pulled them all close. The world was still broken, still uncertain, but tonight, with the beacon sweeping the sea and the warmth of small hands in his, it was enough. A year passed in the slow, unseen way that time has when it is filled with ordinary days, each morning echoing the one before, each night closing with the same steady hush. Summer brought sea wind and wildflowers to Bar Harbor, green seeping into every crack, sun on the boards of the porch. Fall arrived quietly, a sigh of gold and red across the yard, the maple tree at the edge of Frank's property burning in the last sunlight of October. The girls grew taller. Sage's muzzle turned a little grayer. The routines of daily life grew roots. By the next winter, the cottage beneath the lighthouse was no longer new. Not to Frank, not to June or Violet. Not to Sage, who patrolled its rooms with unhurried confidence. The house wore its warmth well, the old wool rug beneath the coffee table, the quilt thrown over the arm of the couch, the battered boots piled by the door, the kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon and bread. Laughter echoed in the hallway, and the walls, once so quiet, now held the music of belonging. On the coldest days, snow pressed against the windows, thick and silent. Frank would stoke the wood stove, coaxing flames from logs that hissed and popped, the fire painting golden light on the girls' faces. June read aloud at the kitchen table, her voice steady and sure while Violet drew, her fingers stained with crayon, filling the margins of the newspaper with dogs and lighthouses. Her world made safe again in paper and ink. Sage took up his post on the braided rug by the door, ears twitching, half asleep but always listening. Sometimes, when the wind howled hard enough to rattle the glass, June would slip from her bed in the small hours, finding Sage in the dark. She'd curl beside him, her breath mingling with his, and feel the weight of loneliness finally slip away. Evenings were the heart of it. The four of them gathered in the living room, Frank at the window, mug in hand, June sprawled with a book, Violet stretched out with Sage's big head in her lap. They listened to the sea roaring beyond the cliffs, the lighthouse beam circling round, slow and certain, cutting through the dark. There was little talk. The greatest truths didn't need saying. Sometimes Frank would look at the girls, then at Sage, and feel a deep, quiet gratitude, a recognition that he had not saved anyone. Not really. He had only stayed. He had opened his door, his hands, his stubborn, wounded heart, and in the giving, found his own healing. He had learned, in the presence of these children and this dog, that the miracle was never in the rescue, but in the enduring, in being there quietly, day after day, through all the cold and all the storm. On the eve of the new year, a snowstorm gathered over the bay. The lighthouse beam swept the night, its rhythm steady as breath. Frank made cocoa, slicing a loaf of sweet bread. the kitchen thick with sugar and warmth. June set the table, humming a tune she'd learned in school. Violet sat at the window, drawing snowflakes on the frosted pane. Sage, content, curled at Frank's feet. After supper, they sat together in the soft light, the wind howling but never quite finding a way in. June leaned her head on Frank's shoulder. Violet, already dozing, whispered something only Sage could hear. The dog lifted his head, eyes full of old wisdom, and nudged her hand in reply. In that wordless moment, a year's worth of fear and hope found its home. Frank closed his eyes, his breath slow, the ache in his chest now the gentle ache of joy. Outside, the storm pressed close, but inside, the fire held, and so did they. No one was perfect, he least of all, but that was never the promise. The promise was only to stay, to listen, to be gentle enough to catch what falls and strong enough to keep the door open. The house beneath the lighthouse glowed warm against the snow. The world turned, uncertain and wild, but inside there was a peace made of small, ordinary things. A child's laughter, the slow wag of a dog's tail, the sturdy hands of a man who had finally learned how to be present. As midnight approached, Frank looked around the room, their room now, all of theirs, and let the gratitude well up. If there was any magic left in the world, it was here. Not in sudden miracles, but in the quiet, unyielding choice to stay. To build something lasting from the weathered pieces of old lives. To be, for one another, the shelter when winter came again. The wind sang in the eaves. Sage stirred and settled. June and Violet, safe in sleep, drifted toward dreams, and Frank, holding it all, felt the fullness of belonging. Enough, at last. Sometimes the real miracle isn't a single moment of heroism, but the quiet courage to stay, with all our scars, all our flaws, beside those who need us most. In a world that often looks away, it is the smallest acts of kindness, the silent loyalty of a dog, and the quiet endurance of an ordinary man that piece together a home from loss and longing. Tonight, under the lighthouse's watchful beam, Frank, Sage, and the girls have found what so many search for. Not perfection, not easy answers, but the simple, lasting warmth of being truly seen and never left behind. If this story touched something in you, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Maybe you too have known the ache of holding on, or the quiet grace of someone who simply stayed. Your words might be the light that reaches someone else, just when they need it most. Thank you for listening and for believing, as we do, that kindness, quiet, stubborn, everyday kindness, can still change a life.